All right. So looking at public opinion data, there's four major types of polls that you have to know. And that's the video will be talking about these two. So opinion polls, that is not a horse race. That's looking at the opinion of the public on a major issue. So an opinion poll looks at things such as abortion rights. Should women have more abortion rights? The economy. Is the economy booming, busting? Is inflation too high, not high enough? Everything you could think of for your money life. It could also be issues that are less important, but typically things that people care about. The border, whether we are descending into something other than democracy. The things that are on people's minds, usually a pollster will have a poll on that. So that is an opinion poll. We have some of those. Right now, though, we're really seeing both benchmark and tracking polls. So benchmark polls are where you have a candidate and you look at the popularity of that candidate. And that gives you a benchmark that you're starting from. And then as the campaign goes, does that candidate become more popular or less popular? You could also go back further if you want. So with Trump, you could start his popularity, if you wish, at the beginning of his campaign over the summer. Or you can go back to when he was still president, all the way to January of 2021. Whatever way you want to play it. With Vice President Harris, you could look at the benchmark while she started as vice president, or when the campaign started. And you do one or the other, and you do it for both candidates. And then you can see how one becomes more popular or less popular over time. And that gives you an idea of how that candidate is doing. Questions here? So the benchmark gives you a baseline, and you see how that baseline goes up and down. Tracking polls, that's what we're seeing pretty much right now. So if you're like me and you get up at 5 in the morning and look on X and see what's going on with the polls, you'll see things such as New Hampshire, which looks like it's in play for one candidate or the other. All right, so like, wow. There was one New Hampshire poll that had Harris up by 15, and there was one that I saw today that had Trump up by 0.3. What's the difference? Well, they're different polls and they use different samples. The one that had Harris up astronomically used a sample of people that had graduate school and bachelor's degree education. Well, that's cheating because that's going to skew heavily to the Democrats. The one that I saw today was also flawed. It had 800 registered voters, which is not very good because you want likely voters. So that one had problems too. So it's hard to find polls that are very good. Most of them are not. But you get an idea still with tracking polls, not necessarily looking at who they say is the winner, but over time looking in the directionality of the poll. So if you followed, for example, the New Hampshire poll that I saw this morning that had Trump up by 0.5, what was that poll a month ago? So then you can see some directionality of how that state is going. You don't necessarily have overflow between states. In other words, how California votes doesn't necessarily affect how Nevada or Arizona are going to vote. It's pretty local in politics. The issues that Pennsylvanians care about, we see in these tracking polls, are not the issues that we care about here, for the most part. So they're fairly local, and so when I see a national poll, it's fairly worthless, right? Because we don't elect people nationally, and people in Pennsylvania don't think like people in the Bay Area do. Tracking polls are a lot of fun. They're horse races, and everyone loves a competition in the United States. So that's what we have. Do the polls work? For the most part, yes, but occasionally they really do get it wrong, as we saw in the 2016 election, which Trump won against Hillary Clinton, but only by a little bit. The 2020 election was called correctly by the polls, who predicted Biden was going to win, but the amount that Biden won was very much off what the polls were saying. So Biden only won also by a little bit, and the polls were saying he was going to win by much more. So we don't know. Are the polls right or wrong? They tend to underestimate Trump, but maybe the pollsters have somewhat, taken that into account now that we're dealing with it for the third time. Maybe not. We'll find out in the real poll that matters, November 5th. We also have exit polls. So exit polls are after someone votes, people ask, well, who did you vote for? Why? They get some reasoning afterwards. Why do you vote this way? Problem with exit polls, of course, are people are dishonest. No one wants to publicly say what they really think if they're in an area where that would be an unpopular opinion. So you always take exit polls with a grain of salt. It does sometimes give you some idea of what's going on, especially if the opinion is a majority opinion in the area, so you know the person isn't necessarily squelching what they really think. All right, so those are the four. Opinion polls, broader issues, such as border security or economics or reproductive rights. Benchmark polls give you where that candidate starts and see if they get more or less popular as time goes on. Tracking polls, which is what we're usually looking at, a candidate changing during campaign, who's more popular. A horse race polls, another way of looking at it, and exit polls. Questions on any of those? Okay, in addition, let's take a look at some of the methodology. So the methodology is best if you have a poll that has a good sample size, if it samples correctly as far as weighting goes. So in California, you better weight fairly heavily towards Democratic voters. In Mississippi, don't do that. In Massachusetts, you probably can have more college-educated voters. In Alabama, probably not. So you have to be pretty smart as far as figuring out all the elements in the local area you are polling and try to replicate those in your sample. How many of you are taking a stats or took a stats class? So good. So you know what I'm talking about as far as sampling and how you do that sort of thing. If you see a poll that has a standard error of more than like 3 or 4%, discard it. It's garbage. Probably not a large enough sample size. 2% is nice. So those are some of the elements we're looking at. That margin of error should be around 2, 3 on a good poll. Next, neutral framing of questions, especially for opinion polls. There's no framing of questions when it's a horse race of who's going to win the president. Who do you prefer? Biden. Who do you prefer? That was a nice Freudian slip. Harris or Trump? All right? It's neutral. Nothing to do, but listen to this one. What do you think should be done with reproductive rights? Should we allow women complete freedom over their bodies? Okay, get the language. Or what do you think of as far as reproductive rights? Should the fetus be considered a human being with the rights to be alive? Yes, I can play with the words and really get whatever I want as far as the response by using words that are not neutral, that have emotional valence to them. And that will get me, the response that I'm looking for. So it's very hard to do. A good pollster will work very, very hard on their questions to try to make them as neutral as possible and therefore get that bias out of the sample that they are looking at. Questions here? Lastly, how are things reported by the press? The press plays all sorts of games when it comes to polling, such as that poll I just described that I saw this morning of Trump being up 0.5% in New Hampshire. Should I say something like, for my headline, Trump up in New Hampshire? That would be misleading. It's within the standard of error. It's only 0.5%. It's basically tied according to this poll. All right? Or should I say something like Trump barely up in New Hampshire? Well, that's also kind of, it's like, I don't know if that's so true either. Often the headlines are misleading headlines to draw people in, and then they say near the bottom of the article what the actual results are, and you go, oh, is that all? You feel kind of tricked. So interpreting the results is also an art form, and believe me, I've talked to some of my colleagues here in my department, and they're all over the map of who they want to win and who they think will win. So someone's going to be right, someone's going to be wrong, but all of us are interpreting the same data that's out there. So it's a fun game that anyone can play, trying to figure out who is going to actually win this election and how it should be interpreted. Questions?